Good evening, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. Jazakallah so much for staying with us. It's been a week of a lot of events, but here at home, we've witnessed something we thought we may never see in a democratic South Africa. Racism in schools. Yes, it still exists. And it exists at a time where we're asking ourselves, how could this happen? How could there be an allowance for educators to let their pupils commit these heinous acts? 400 years of colonialism and apartheid had passed us, and we're still asking the question, how can this be allowed? How can this be filtered through? The Pretoria High School for Girls is an example with regards to that, and there are now allegations emerging that its principal actually knew about a whites-only WhatsApp group. It is disturbing, very, very disturbing. Now, to talk to us, I'd like to welcome the Gauteng Education Department spokesperson, Steve Mabona, just to talk about this and what obviously their department is going to do to try and remedy this, but also to make sure this does not happen in any of the schools. Steve, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Good evening and to all our viewers.
Steve, I think before we talk about just, the department's plan, I was saying that, this shouldn't have been allowed. This can't be allowed. We're in an era where the Constitution allows there to be multiracialism, non-sexism, non-discrimination, and yet we have schools still feeling you could live back in the days of apartheid and colonialism.
Yes, it is quite concerning, as it were. That's why we had to launch an investigation looking at the allegations that were made against our employees and making sure that we continue with that investigation, because there were a lot of allegations that were put on the table, as it were, against our employees. Parallel to that, the SGB had to conduct a disciplinary process, against the learners that were implicated there. They also suspended another learner who was also implicated in racial undertones. So, as it were, we continued with that. We're continuing actually with our internal investigation. But the sad part is that already they are done with the disciplinary process, but we were not informed about the outcome.
That's where I want to start off, because obviously there's the SGB, there's the school's internal body that will be doing the investigation, and of course, there's the Gauteng Education Department that's doing its own investigation. How much of a middle ground does there need to be in terms of these two stakeholders finding the middle ground? And what is it that the Gauteng Education Department wants to make sure that something like this does not happen again and the actual perpetrators of these heinous acts are brought to book?
For us is to look at the bigger picture, looking at the program that we've already identified, diversity management and social cohesion, which Matthew Goniwe School of Leadership and Governance have actually come on board to say they will be assisting us, looking at the parent body, learner, and our employees on how we infuse that program to say we are in the same environment. We must understand that we are diverse. We should be in a position to tolerate each other and focus on what we are there for. Development. That institution must develop the learners. We need to have an impact in their upbringing. We need to have an impact in skills nurturing, because we need to understand that we are an institution that must do that. So we will continue with our investigation that is, against the employees, as it were.
Steve, there's obviously two parts to this. There's the pupils, the learners, and there's obviously the teachers. And there has to be a coexistence between the two to allow there to be a harmonious education environment, and that environment needs to foster that. And Obviously, the Gauteng Education Department has brought that to the book to try and make sure that that fostering of goodwill, non-sexism, non-racialism is brought there. So from a teacher's perspective, I mean, how much of a responsibility do they need to take being out and out educators, because they are at the end the actual role models? Them, the principals, those who are part of the HOD need to be showing that they are the actual role models to these pupils. So how much of a responsibility is it on them to really play that part?
No, that's why we've decided to enhance them. We need to develop them to have that understanding. But on the other score, we can't focus on educators only, because some of these things are perpetuated at home. So you need to go to the parent body and say, these are the things that are happening, and how do we mitigate and make sure that they are things of the past? Because you need to deal with the system than individuals. But it looks like this is a systematic challenge that we have, which we really need to nip, and also focus then on everyone that is there. So that's what we'll be doing, from the department perspective.
And then obviously you've mentioned it, this starts at home, the pupils, the actual learners. I mean, the Gauteng Education Department can't go to every learner and say, well, we're going to watch you from your house on what's being said to you or what's being educated to you, because that's nigh and impossible. It cannot happen. But within the school, how much does there need to be a fostering of goodwill, education in that regards, making sure that these learners understand what South Africa we are currently in? Because my understanding is there seems to be learners who still think it's okay to go ahead and act like we're still in apartheid or colonialism, and there's going to be really no punishment for us.
No, you're correct. It's quite important for us to make sure that our program will be then monitored. Because you'll remember that in 2016, we experienced racial undertones and, things that were unaccepted. But the implicated perpetrators left the system. The learners who experienced this also left the system. Now we have new learners, we have new parent body, and the educators, to a certain extent, some of them, they've been there, but there were no implications or rather, allegations against anything. So that's why it's important that we will then have to monitor the program that we're going to unleash now. Must be monitored constantly to see whether are there any successes, because we cannot leave it now, because the information at our disposal dictate that we need to do something about this.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Steve Mabona. Yes, there's programs, there's a plan for the future, but how are we going to stop racism from entering all the schools across the province, especially schools where there are so many different race groups within our country? Do stay tuned. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Gauteng Education spokesperson Steve Mabona. I think, Steve, Malume Chilwane, I think it's a very, very difficult start for the MEC, because, nobody really wants to go ahead and really begin his or her term on such a very difficult note. I mean, this is a difficult note right now. So what is the MEC really planning on doing from a future perspective in terms of education? Of course, it's going to require many stakeholders to come to the party. It's going to require even the private sector to come into the party to say, listen, how do we go ahead and really foster a different environment within schools? And obviously, it's not just Pretoria High School for girls, but it's going to be other schools where this could be happening and there's no real revelations occurring because either students are afraid to come out and speak about it, or number two, it's become the norm. So I want to talk about especially the second part, the norm, because when something's created as a norm, it's just forgotten about. So how is the education department, along with various stakeholders, going to say, well, it's time to change the norm and really create a different environment of good fostering education within these institutions?
We will implement that in many schools. that's why we encourage parents to reach out to us. If they, reach out to the schools and there's nothing that they, getting in terms of responses, they will have to reach out to us so that we can then be in a position to assist them. So it's something that we'll be looking at potentially other schools, most especially in the same area. We know that there are some of the schools that have the same, allocations, as it were, and we should be in a position to utilize the program that we've already identified and make sure that we unleash it in the other schools so that we don't have a system challenge that we have.
Steve, from an entire Gauteng legislature's perspective, of course, I mean, the Premier's got his duties, the other MECs have their duties, but what needs to be done from an overall basis really to create education starting at home? Now, it's difficult because some may say, well, we don't have access to it, but how can the Gauteng government say education starts at home? Is there a plan for that to potentially happen where it doesn't start in the schools, that there's something that starts within the actual homes of these learners, where that fostering of goodwill and understanding that we're in a democratic South Africa is created because you actually learn from the examples that are given to you?
You will understand that life orientation at different schools is offered, and most of the values and on the behavioral patterns on how learners must understand on how we need to lead our lives, it's carried there. They are reminded there on how to manage that. So we'll continue with that process, but this program is going to be assisting us because you will then have all those elements. But like you are saying, we will not be in a position to be in different homes, but we'll rely on the SGP once these programs are presented, then to assist us during their meetings with the parents, make them aware of what we are doing so that we can then work together on this.
Steve, there have been incidents also of, I mean, you saw in the Western Cape, and I know you're not in a position to talk because that is not where your sphere of governance is, where you've had children being auctioned. Yes, auctioned like it's the 16 or the 1700s, dare I say even the 1800s, where slave trade became normalized, where you have children being auctioned in these various Western Cape schools. I mean, you're looking at that, I mean, in a space of a week, incidents like Pretoria High School for girls and what we've seen in the Western Cape have occurred. I mean, the Basic Education Department itself really is looking at this and saying, well, there has to be a way to stop this from happening. From a South African institutional point of view, I mean, more education needs to be done with regards to that, but not just education, and understanding of really the challenges that are presented in high school and how this can change.
Look, we need to work together as stakeholders. That's why in government we have what we call clusters. We have a social cluster which entails us as education, Department of Social Development, health. Now we have an added on sports. Work together and an element of community safety to say, in the event of this challenge, how do we intervene? So that you can tap into social development, educate on elements that you are interested in. You can tap into Department of Health, on health education, just to make sure that learners understand on how safe they are in terms of their health. And then look at community safety, look at the collaboration with police. How do you, behave in certain areas, alert them on things that are not supposed to be done in certain areas. So all that, we are doing it in a cluster format so that we then alleviate anything that might be a challenge for us.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
That's Steve Mabona, that's Gauteng Education Department spokesperson. We've got a few minutes, and I think it's important to touch on what has happened this week because it's disturbing. It's disturbing. I mean, we see in the Western Cape auctions happening. and it's been recorded on phones. Of course, these days, high school students can take their phones through. And therein lies, of course, the problem. When you are open to social media, you have this opportunity to go ahead and record these things. And this is disturbing. It's disturbing because many people assume that we can still go back to the days of slavery, the dark days of slavery, where these slave masters would go to different parts of the world, especially in Africa, in Latin America, and just take people away from their families, auction them off, and then that's it. It's 2024. I mean, this can't be happening. And whether it's the Gauteng Department, whether it's the Western Cape Department, they need to act on it. They need to go ahead and say, this can't happen. These students need to be either suspended or brought to book. And it starts in their home. So the parents of these students who are committing these heinous acts need to be also brought to book. Now, from a criminal justice perspective, of course, a criminal justice expert would be able to expand on this. But the punishment needs to occur, because if it's allowed to be the norm, if it's allowed to just carry on, then these students are going to make this as some sort of a break time activity for themselves, instead of going to the library or studying for exams or tests or playing sports. They're now going and saying, we can lock up our fellow pupils and we can film them as an auction that is happening. That is an absolute disgrace. And then in Pretoria High School for girls, a whites-only WhatsApp group. I mean, where do you get that? Where do you get that? That is, again, education that starts at home, but is not being filtered. It's been filtered down to these pupils who think it's okay for it to happen. And then you have discrimination happening in these groups, derogatory words that are being used. And then there's these allegations of the actual school principal knowing about this, but not doing anything. There has to be a sense of acting of this, because if this is going to allow it to continue, then South Africa's supposed rehabilitation from apartheid, even if it is 30 years on, is going to take even longer than what we would like it to be. And when we talk of nation building, well, this is getting nowhere close to nation building. We can have the Tatiana Smiths winning gold, which we all get happy about. And yes, we should as a country get happy about. We can have the Springboks winning the World Cups. We can have the Proteas reaching finals of World Cups. We can have all of these good things happening in our country. But if we're not solving the root issues of our country, which is inherent racism that is happening in schools, yes, in schools. What about workplaces? What about other areas of creativity? What about other areas of the economy where racial acts are happening? It can't work like this. And we hope that the Education Department really does put their foot down, because if another incident like this happens, the nation building that we as a country want is not going to be the way we want it. Well, that's all I have for you here on News in Focus. From myself, for Hospital, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg, do have yourself a good weekend, but most importantly, a safe one. I'll see you on Monday. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.